Hello and welcome to the 5th edition of the Ryno Sports Talk podcast. Before I begin, I want to talk about my blog this week. I put up the NFL wildcard preview, as that was this week's blog post, so if you want to go check that out, link in the description. And so I guess with that, I'm going to go jump right into this. First thing I want to talk about is the Black Monday. It happened this week. What it usually is right after the season. It's the first Monday, so this year it'd be the 4th. In the NFL season, Black Monday is the first Monday after the season, and that's where all the coaches, or where coaches usually get released at, I guess, is the best way to say that. And we had a bunch of firings this week, so I found a list. I'm just going to go down the line, talk about why they got fired, or why they quit, or why they're not the coach anymore, I guess, and then who I think could be a replacement for him. So we're going to start off with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. These were the last guys to, I guess, announce that their coach was gone. They were the last one to say that they cut their coach. And I think this happened on Wednesday, not entirely on Monday. So I'm still going to count it as Black Monday. So they fired Coach Lovie Smith. He had an 8-24 record over the last 2 years, but he's expected to be replaced by Dirk Koetter, who's the offensive coordinator at the moment for Tampa Bay. They kind of just want to keep him with Jameis Winston, keep the rookie in the same system for second year, just so that they can have the same expected, I guess, the same expected ability, and so he can keep his growth going. So that's who I think is going to replace him at Tampa Bay. Next up is the Giants. They had Tom Coughlin resign as their head coach, and he said it felt like the best decision. It was the best decision for the best interest of the organization, and he's expected to be coaching again, but don't know where exactly or who. And they've interviewed a bunch of people, and I don't really know who they're really looking at for a coach. I know that you can rule out Chip Kelly and Adam Gase, but I think that they're going to go someone maybe in-house, maybe like Tampa Bay, bump their OC up, or find a big-name splash kind of guy. It really depends. I have no idea on them. I haven't heard anything about them recently. And then the Browns are the next up ones. They fired Mike Pettin, and he was 10-22 as the coach, and I think that's 2 years. Yeah, 2 years. And the general manager, Ray Farmer, was also released, and they're kind of just trying to clean house, because Farmer had the thing about texting coaches plays and all that stuff a couple years ago, and he kind of was destined to be gone. I thought Pettit was cut a little bit too early. Give him another year or something. They're interviewing a bunch of old former coaches and defensive coordinators. The one that sticks out to me is Doug Marrone, the old coach of the Bills. I think he might be able to do something with the Browns team, but never really know. They also have a couple coordinators here. They're interested in interviewing offensive coordinator Hugh Jackson from the Bengals. I think that might be a good plan for them. But once again, you never know if he's going to be a good coach. I think if I remember right, he was the one that coached the Raiders, and they kind of were not very good back when he coached them. So I don't know what the Browns would do with him, but I guess. And then the 49ers had cut their coach, Jim Tomsula. I kind of predicted this last week, and it was only his first year. I don't know why they would cut him, but the expected guy that go there is Chip Kelly. Oh, and I saw this here. The former coach Shanahan is expected to interview as well, but I think Shanahan might go to the Giants. That's the guy I was trying to think of when I was talking about the Giants. So keep that in mind. Mike Shanahan to the Giants, that might happen. But Chip Kelly is expected to take the 49ers coach there. He's expected to take that job. I think he's going to do really well with Colin Kaepernick as the quarterback. Him as the coach, he's got the perfect system for them, but I guess we'll see what happens there. Another one's the Eagles, who cut Chip Kelly early. I think it was last Wednesday or Thursday. I talked about that last podcast. And they haven't really... I know that they're talking to Coughlin, but I think that's about the only one that they're really talking to. And then a guy that's name has been thrown around a lot is Terrell Austin. I don't know where he is assistant at, but he might be a big name there for someone to come in and I guess, get. So the next up is the Dolphins, and interestingly enough, I'll get to that here in a second, I guess. Let me get back to my thing. So the Dolphins had fired their coach midseason, and then they gave a interview to Dan Campbell, the interim coach, and he didn't get the job, but they could keep him on as a tight end coach or an assistant head coach, something like that, from what I'm hearing. But before I say who they did hire, they had interest in Mike Smith and a couple other guys like Shanahan and Terrell Austin, who's been named in a bunch of these teams. But the actual coach that they hired was Adam Gase, the former Broncos and now former Bears coordinator. So I'm going to be interested to see what he can do there. He's known for fixing quarterbacks and making his offense quarterback centric. He fixed Jay Cutler last year with throwing like 7 less picks or something like that. And it's going to be really interesting to see what he can do with Tannehill, who's got the skills to be a good quarterback, but just has never had the coaching or the system, I guess. So moving on to the Titans, they're not going to keep Mike Mularkey, the interim coach, but they're also looking at Chip Kelly, who's expected to be a high candidate there. I think that they would give him a lot of money to go there, just because him and Mariota would be good to coach. Would be a good combination there. They have chemistry from being in the same college and all that. So I'll be really interested to see what happened there. And they have the number 1 pick too, so that's gonna be a really high sought after position, I guess. And I think that the general manager also wasn't renewed, which is kind of interesting. So they're looking for both, and they're looking at the Ravens assistant and a couple other guys for that one. But I don't really know who to go with the coach here. I think it's going to have to be someone that knows Mariota or has coached running quarterbacks before. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see what happens. And I guess I'm going to move on to more of the safe side, but not really completely safe, is Jim Caldwell of the Lions. He doesn't have a general manager at the moment, so he's still technically the coach, but he's kind of expected to be fired unless they get someone that likes him a lot as the general manager. So that one's still up in the air, and they still are looking for a GM. So I don't know what they're really thinking or what they're going to do there. They are looking at the Patriots pro scouting director for their GM, which would be really good for them, I think, at least because he's a good coach, or he knows the guys like Belichick and all that, and they always draft well. They always get really good guys on their team and all that stuff. But now we're going to move into the completely safe coaches, and the first one is Sean Payton of the Saints. He still a coach there. He didn't get fired. He didn't get traded or anything. I thought he would personally, but I mean it still could happen. But I don't think that that's going to happen. So we're going to see what happens next year with him, I guess, especially with Drew Brees coming back, and if they can get a good defensive coordinator and buff up the defense a lot, he's really going to be safe and maybe even make a title run next year. And then next up is Chuck Pagano from the Colts. I thought he was going to be fired and replaced with Saban, but it was interestingly they kept Ryan Grigson also, who was a GM and kind of on the fence kind of deal. Like he could have been gone, could have stayed kind of thing. But anyway, Pagano's still there. He actually signed an extension, which is kind of interesting to me. I didn't think him and Grigson would get along. And the most interesting part about this is that they pursued Sean Payton but didn't get him. So I guess that's kind of like, oh, we didn't get Payton, so we're going to keep Pagano. Might as well keep what we got already. He's pretty good. So, and then another one is Mike McCoy of the Chargers. I thought he might have been gone too. I can't remember what I said. I know midweek I thought he was going to be gone, like after I posted the last podcast on that. And he stayed as still the coach of the Chargers, and honestly I think that's a good idea. He lost a lot of pieces, and he really was destined, set up for a bad year with the amount of injuries they had and bad schedule and just a bunch of stuff. But we'll see what he can do next year for the LA Chargers or San Diego Chargers, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. And then the last big name one is Jeff Fisher, and he was expected to be. He's on the hot seat coming into next year, and he was right currently at the around this time the past couple of years, just because he's not really a good coach. He's pretty middle of the pack, 8-8. I thought he was going to be cut just because of the bad offense, and he picked up Nick Foles for like traded Nick Foles for a bunch of big items and got really nothing out of him. So I was kind of expected that he was going to be gone. And then the last three names here, I got Gus Bradley. He signed an extension. He's from the Jaguars. They're not really that good, but they could be good next year. Watch out for that preview coming up here soon. It's going to be a special episode after the Super Bowl. Jason Garrett is expected to be kind of kept, but next year's going to be interesting to see if they keep him or not. He's on the Cowboys. They just finished 4-12, but he kind of had a scapegoat with Romo and Dez being out for so long. And then Rex Ryan of the Bills. They announced that he's going to be back, but he didn't really have a great year either. So guess we're going to see what happens with the Bills and Rex Ryan next year. And that's all for the Black Monday preview. And now we're going to jump into college football. And in college football, this is a big week as it is the college football playoff final, a championship, whatever you want to call it. And I want to touch on just one thing real quick, and that's that last week they had worse television ratings for the playoff semifinal than they did last year, just because they put it on the New Year's Eve. And I do think that they should keep it on New Year's Day, just because everyone's going to be watching it and all that stuff. And that's just kind of a New Year's Day equals football, college football kind of thing. Kind of like how the first weekend in February equals Super Bowl, or the last weekend in January equals Pro Bowl, or something like that. It's just kind of, that day is focused on, or Thanksgiving equals football kind of thing. You just know that day equals that sport, kind of. So I think they should keep it on New Year's Day. But now moving into the college football playoff championship, which is coming up next Monday. That's between Clemson and Alabama. I think I previewed this on my post a little bit, or I previewed it last week. I can't remember. But I do believe that Alabama is going to have an interesting time containing Clemson. I know that Clemson has Tajh Boyd, who's one of the best dual threat quarterbacks currently in the NFL, and in the NCAA, and Alabama took an interesting way of preparing for him. They took their incoming. He's going to be eligible next year, but he enrolled early so he can practice now. I can't remember the name of him, but he's a dual threat quarterback. He throws really well. He's really fast, and they're trying to use him as Deshaun Watson. It's going to be interesting to see what that does for them, how that pays off, I guess. And then it's going to be interesting because Alabama's got a good defense. Saban's known for his defense, not really for his offense. Coker, he played really well in the semifinal game, but that's because Michigan State's a insanely good run-stopping defense, and Alabama knew that. So when they tried to run down the gut with Henry, and they couldn't get anything, they're like, oh, well, Coker's pretty good, let's give it to him. I want to see what he does for, I guess, the second game, his second big game. Does he do that again? Is he going to kind of, I don't want to say choke, but not show up and just be like, oh, yeah, I'm just a game manager. I know what I was doing the last game. We had a good game plan kind of deal. And throw for like 190 and a touchdown or something like that? Or is he going to go 300, 4 touchdowns like he did last time? And then on the Clemson side of the ball, Clemson has Deshaun Watson, like I said. They have a couple playmakers, Mike Williams on the outside. They have a really stout offensive line. Can they do better than what Michigan State did? Hopefully Clemson learns and watches the film. They see that Alabama rushed a bunch on the right side, and that kind of, they moved Deshaun Hand, I think that's his name, Hand to the right, to the outside, and they moved the defensive tackle over to the right hash, to basically between the right guard and the center most of the game, because Michigan State's right side of their line was pretty weak. And I kind of delved into that with my recap of it on last week's podcast. And I do think Clemson if they get Watson going and being able to carve up that defense, Clemson will win this game. But if they don't, I think Alabama does. It's really dependent on what Watson can do and what their Clemson's offense can do. Alabama's defense is going to be good, like usual, but how good are they going to be is the real question here. And like I said, if Watson can start throwing on him and running on him, he's the type of quarterback that gives Alabama questions and kind of hurts Alabama. Like if you remember a couple of years ago, they had when Texas A&M still had Johnny Manziel, he carved up Alabama's defense. If Clemson takes that kind of thing, that kind of game plan, and watches that film, uses Watson like that, I think they're going to be good, and they're going to be set with that one. And I think Clemson has enough on the other side of the ball. They have some good linebackers and linemen. Shaq Lawson's the best lineman in the NCAA coming into the draft, and I think he's going to try and get pressure on Coker, and he's going to stop Derrick Henry on his side. It's going to be what can those linebackers in the middle, the middle linebackers and the defensive tackle, what can they do to contain Henry if he runs up the gut? And then what can the corners and safeties do against this kind of decent wide receiver group that Alabama has? It's going to be really interesting to see, and it's going to be one of my games of the week, which I'll talk about here in just a second, in just a little bit. And I don't know what Clemson's going to do offensively. Defensively, they're going to do the same thing. Shaq Lawson's going to bring the rush, bring the power. Defensive tackle is going to be able to get some pressure, and their other defensive end's going to get some pressure too. But can their corners and safeties hold up the whole game? Can their linebackers contain Henry and contain Drake? Henry Drake, I think. Drake, this change of pace running back, and he not bust out 50-yard runs or 30-yard runs, kind of big runs again, like he did against Michigan State. And I think that's kind of what Alabama falled back on, is after they figured out Henry wasn't doing anything, they kind of like, oh, let's put Drake in. He's fast. He's going to outrun everyone to the edge. They're not really expecting it. And I think Drake's a little bit better runner just because he's a little bit more agile and faster than Henry is. So that's going to be something to watch there. And then the biggest question for Alabama's offense is, well, I guess Clemson's defense biggest question with Clemson on defense and Alabama on offense is who contains O.J. Howard. He's one of the best tight ends in the league. He's got the power, catching ability, and speed to be another Rob Gronkowski type. So we're going to see what happens there, see who guards him, see how they guard him, and that's going to be kind of a key to the game for Clemson on defense. And yeah, I still think Clemson wins this if they can contain Henry and O.J. Howard. Coker's not really going to be a huge factor, but if they contain O.J. Howard, Coker isn't a factor. So I think Clemson takes it. So this week, the MLB, I guess it was the Baseball Writers Association, announced the Hall of Fame for the MLB, and two people got elected this year, and I thoroughly enjoyed watching both of them when I was younger and they were still in the league. It was Ken Griffey and Mike Piazza were elected, and what's really interesting is that Ken Griffey broke the record per percentage of votes, and he got 99.3%. Only 3 people didn't vote for him, and that's insane because the last one was it was Nolan Ryan, and it was 98.9, I believe. That's just crazy to think that these guys are near unanimous Hall of Famers, but they're not actual, and they're when I think of Nolan Ryan, I think of the 9 perfect games he threw, or 9 no-hitters and perfect games, whatever it was. I just think of him being the most dominant pitcher of all time, and then Ken Griffey is the most energetic young dude who hit 600 home runs, and that's just crazy to me. But speaking on Mike Piazza, he had 83% of the vote as well, so he got in. What's needed for the election is 75%. And just missing out on the cut was Jeff Bagwell, 71, Tim Raines at 69, and Trevor Hoffman at 67. And then there's Schilling, Clemens, Barry Bonds, and Edgar Martinez at 53 or below. So I think that those voting results kind of show that they're not really ready to accept the steroids in the hall yet. And I'm going to be really interested to see what happens over the next coming years, because I know I'm gonna talk about this in a little bit, but some people got voted off too. So, but staying on with Mike Piazza, he was an interesting fact was he was the lowest drafted player in the Hall of Fame. He was drafted in the 62nd round, 1,390th overall by the Dodgers in 1988. He was a 12-time All-Star as well, and that just blows my mind that he's a 62nd round pick and he's in the Hall of Fame now. Like, that's amazing for these guys to be able to go into the Hall of Fame and at like being a 62nd round pick and going in. That's just a mind-boggling. And Piazza's one of the best hitting power catchers that I know of. At least like when I think of power hitting people like catchers and stuff, I think of him, Pudge Rodriguez, and then that's really about it. At least from my era. I mean, there's obviously guys like Johnny Bench and I can't even think of anyone else. Honestly, I don't really follow the old sports that much, but I know like Piazza, he hit 308 in the league at 307 or 377 on base, or yeah, that'd be on base, and then 544 slugging. That's really good. And then he had over 2,000 hits, 427 home runs, 1,335 RBIs, 12-time All-Star, like I said, and ranks first among all catchers in home runs, slugging, and OPS plus, which I don't know all the sabermetric stuff. I'm just going to leave that alone. And he played a majority of his 16-year career with the Dodgers and the Mets. So he played 16 years with just 2 teams. That's insane. And I think when I was looking at some more different kind of stats for this, he was intentionally walked, or no, he was walked 759 times, 146 of those intentionally. That just kind of shows what kind of respect he gets from the like most of these pitchers, like Clemens, and then I think he was at the tail end of Nolan Ryan and a couple of these younger guys like Roy Halladay and the guys that were in his era. They just respected him that much that they didn't even want to pitch to him. But like I said earlier, he's not really a defensive. He's not known for his defensive prowess, but he did earn 10 Gold Gloves, which is pretty impressive. But he also had 124 errors, which is in the top 5 catchers all time. And he caught 423 people stealing, but only had a 23% caught stealing rate. So take that with a grain of salt. That's not really good. I mean, it's almost a fourth of the guys he throws out, but then about the average now is about 30, 35. So he's a little bit below average. But he still earned 10 Gold Gloves and as well as the 93 Rookie of the Year. So I think that's still impressive, and he really deserves it, especially for being the offensive powerhouse that he was. He really could place the ball wherever he wanted off the bat. He could do about anything. Batting-wise, didn't have to hit for home runs or anything, but he did. And I think Mike Piazza is just he's a great, I guess, ambassador for the game. Everyone knows him. He's really, like, outgoing. He's a nice guy from what I know, and he's just like a great guy for the game. So, and same with Ken Griffey Jr. Talking about Griffey, I'm gonna throw out a couple stats here. He had 630 home runs, 1,836 stolen bases, and only caught 69 times. He had 8 seasons of over 300 batting average, which is with his highest being a 327. Plus, he was walked 246 times. I mean, staying on the batting average, you have 8 seasons hitting over 300. That's insane. And like most of them they weren't like 301 or 302. There's like 2 308s in there, but most of them were like 316, 320, 327, which was his highest, and 324 and all that stuff. And then he just garnered respect from all these pitchers, where he had 246 intentional walks. That's crazy. And then he also ended up with almost 3,000 hits, 2,781, which ranks 50th currently. And in the field, like, obviously, I think he's a great hitter. Everyone knows he's a great hitter. He almost had 700 home runs. When you think of Ken Griffey, you just think of him being a home run king. I think he was the MLB home run leader like 4 times, hitting almost 50 each time. And he garnered 7 Silver Sluggers, which is super impressive. And then in '97, he even got an MVP for his ability to hit and defensive ability. He's just one of the best players I've ever seen. I mean, like, I wasn't around when like Nolan Ryan and all those guys were, but Griffey knows what he's doing. He's one of the best guys in the league. And especially talking about like what awards he got. He had the 2005 Comeback Player of the Year, because I think he got hurt in 2004 and got traded to the Reds, I think. That sounds right. Or maybe he was still on the Reds. I remember in 2004 he was on the Reds, and same with the 05. Because that was like his prime years before he, like when he was like in the middle of his prime, when he was really young and energetic. He was on the Mariners, then to the Reds, and then back to the, well, he played a year on the White Sox, and then 2 back to the Mariners. But he's always been a good fielding hitter, or a good fielder too, as well as hitter. He had 89 errors and a 985 fielding percentage. That's insane. Like, only having 89 errors, that's obviously he's an outfielder, so he didn't have a lot of opportunities to make an error outside of probably throws and missing a diving catch, but he never really missed any of those. I think most of those errors are throwing, but it didn't really break it down at all. And with that 985 fielding percentage, obviously comes some hardware. He got 10 Gold Gloves in his career. That's just That's just mind-boggling to me. But that's all I can say. I think those two are really, really great assets to the Hall of Fame. They're really deserving of it. I think next couple of years are going to be really interesting. And I'm going to talk about, just real quickly, who missed the cut. So I already said everyone up. I said Bagwell, Raines, Hoffman, Kurt Schilling, Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds, Edgar Martinez, Mike Mussina missed it, Adam Trammell, Lee Smith, Fred McGriff, Jeff Kent, Larry Walker, who is a former Rocky, which I hope he gets in there, but I don't know what the chances are of him getting in there, but he got 15% this year, so that's kind of promising. Mark McGwire, he got 12%. Sheffield got 11 with his wacky stance and all that. Billy Wagner got 10%. And then this is where we're kind of getting near the bottom. Like, I think it's 5%. You have to get 5% of the votes to stay on. And what's interesting right here is Sosa only got 7% this year. So I think that might kind of show that no one really thinks he should be in there, be in the Hall, just because of his admittance to the steroids and all that stuff. But I guess we'll see what happens in the future years. So to keep going here, I got Jim Edmonds. These are the guys that missed the cut, by the way. Got Jim Edmonds at 2.5%, who really should be in the Hall. He's a really upstanding guy. Nomar Garcia-Parra at 1.8. Sweeney at 0.7. Eckstein at 0.5. Kendall at 0.5. Garrett Anderson at 0.2. And then all these guys didn't even get votes. I'm going to name off here. Brad Osmus, who's the current Tigers manager. Luis Castillo, Troy Gloss, Mark Gredzlanek, Mike Hampton, and Mike Lowell, and Randy Wynn. So I think the Hall got it right this year. It's going to be interesting to see what happens next year with the new first ballots and what they're going to do. I don't think there's going to be 2 guys that are going to come really close to breaking Ken Griffey's record, and that's going to be Jeter and Rivera. I think if Harper and Trout eventually just keep staying on this pace where they're hitting about 300, 350, getting MVPs every other year kind of thing, just like insanely good numbers, I think they might break it. But currently I think Jeter and Rivera are the only ones that are really close to it. The end of the season doesn't just mean that NFL coaches get fired. There's also more news. Like this year, 3 teams, the Rams, the Chargers, and the Raiders, all filed for relocation. Interesting note before I get too far into this is that the Chargers and Raiders filed for a joint stadium. This is interesting because they're division rivals, so I don't think that this could go through as easily as the Rams would. But it would cause too many issues, scheduling, as well as a split fan base that the NFL is trying to build back up, not kind of try and prevent the fan base and try and split some. But I do believe that the Chargers, if they go alone, can move. But the Raiders have brought back enough energy and youth to their fan base not to warrant a move. I think that the Raiders are one of the big sleepers going into next year. while the Chargers are not as good, but they weren't really healthy this year. So, I mean, they could be good next year. And they have very little fan support at home. I remember Bill Simmons and a couple other guys talking about how their home was really a neutral field site because they didn't. It was mostly opposing teams bringing in their fans kind of deal. And I think they have the better chance to move out of those two. The Rams are the third team I talked about, and they have the best chance to leave. They're in the middle of a rebuild as a franchise. Their stadium lease is up. I think it's either this year or next year. And I think it is this year, actually. And the biggest thing, at least to me, is that they play in the NFC West. I mention this because they're the farthest east team in the division by a wide margin. This calls for one of two things, in my opinion. The first option is restructuring the divisions and conferences, which I'll do a little thing later. And I'm going to do a whole little piece on my blog about that. And that could be shaking up things and moving teams around to different things, or just changing up the format completely for divisions. It's well overdue, but that's for a different time, like I said. The second and more plausible option is to have the Rams move west. The NFC West is home to Seattle, San Francisco, and Arizona. Obviously, Seattle and San Francisco are on the West Coast completely, and Arizona's basically, I think, one state over from California. But St. Louis is also in that, so it's only logical to move that last team with basically no stadium, a rich owner that has a plan for the stadium in LA already, and just move them to LA. The Rams would not even have to change their logo and name or rebrand the team, as they were formerly the LA Rams. They might have to change their uniform colors back to the yellow or gold or whatever you want to call it, but that's not as big as going from the Chargers to like the LA Knights or something like that. So I think that might be a big thing for them to do. And the one thing that the Rams would bring, especially with going back to LA, they would bring excitement for older guys. They'd have like people that grew up back then that had the LA Rams. They would be like, "Oh, LA Rams are back. We might start rooting for them again." And it would bring excitement with that. The older generation might get the younger kids be like, "Hey, this is the new LA Rams. Look at what my LA Rams did," kind of thing. And the excitement that a team can bring is always a major problem for any team trying to relocate or move. And to make relocation work, teams need to have a product or gimmick to sell at the new city or stadium. Basically, a way to sell the fans on the team. And I think that bringing a team back would be a great way to start. That would be a great start to that. I think that Oakland or the Raiders has the best chance to do that in this aspect, as they have a bunch of young pieces in Derek Carr, Amari Cooper, and Khalil Mack that the Chargers and Rams don't have. The Rams don't really have a quarterback at the moment. They do have an exciting defense, but defense is kind of getting phased out with all the new rules and stuff. So I think that with Derek Carr and Cooper and Khalil Mack all being three exciting young pieces that are going to be locked up for the future here in a couple of years by the Raiders, they have a bunch of young pieces to build around. And they can start making a legit team and a legit run into the playoffs here even as early as next year with those guys, if they draft right this year. I still think it's the Rams or Chargers who move, though. Maybe even both. Who knows? I mean, that might work a lot better if you have two different teams. Just look at the Jets and Giants. One's in the AFC, one's in the NFC, like the Chargers and Rams, and they're both in two different divisions. And they split the time there. The one thing I don't like about relocation is the fact that these multi-million-dollar owners, and billion-dollar in the Rams case and a couple other cases, these owners that are worth a bunch of money make the public pay for these stadiums. Yeah, they do have to pay a relocation fee, but I think a stadium that's worth $2 billion is a lot pricier and should be paid for by the owners rather than the taxpayers. And I don't understand why that happens. Why do the rich keep getting richer by moving and getting more money from a fresh new fan base by selling jerseys and getting new jerseys to sell? Like with the Rams, they can just they get different jerseys to sell in a different thing or a different market area, and then they have different hats and memorabilia and stuff, and it's just crazy that these rich owners just keep getting that much richer from that kind of stuff, and they're not even really paying for the move. Yeah, they pay the $500 million fee for the moving fee, I guess it is, or the relocation fee is what it's technically called, but that's still nothing compared to that $2 billion that the taxpayers are paying to make that stadium, where they still have to pay for tickets that are going to be insanely high, and for jerseys and memorabilia, which are still going to be insanely high because that's what everyone in the whole NFL does. Like, NFL, do you really have to take more money and be even more greedy from your fans and charge these huge sums of money from everything, from tickets, like I said earlier, where you're paying like $400 for like I think it's like 3 rows up for like $400 or something like that, or $100 for nosebleeds, or like 50 for nosebleeds. And then the jerseys, like I've seen jerseys like Bronco jerseys like Manning and Von Miller and stuff like that sell for $120, and hats for like 30. Like, that's just insane that people are paying that much for a jersey or a hat or whatever. But I guess whatever the NFL does works. They're making a bunch of money. Like I said earlier, Roger Goodell is making $44 million a year. It shouldn't be that way, but I guess it works in their eyes, and they can just be even greedier and greedier as long as people keep buying tickets. So I just don't see why people are still paying for this and all this kind of stuff. Like, they shouldn't be. They should be the owners that want to move their team for some reason, either make more money or whatever, that have to pay for the stadium as well, not make the people of the city pay for it. So I really hope that that's not the case, but I still think it will be. That's the only downside of relocation to me, at least that I can see. So guess we'll see what happens in the coming weeks with these relocations. I haven't watched a bunch of NBA this year, but I do know that in the NBA it's widely known that the Western Conference is usually the stronger conference and much deeper than the East. Now that script is flipped. The East seems a little bit deeper than the West this year and seems to be a little bit stronger as well. Looking purely at standings to begin with, the West as of Friday have 2 teams that are under 500 in the playoffs currently, and another that's just 1 game over. So 3 teams that are basically hovering around 500 or worse that are in the playoffs right now. That's looking at the bottom of the conference, obviously, or the bottom of the playoffs of the conference. If you move up just a little bit to the top, you see a little bit better with just 2 teams that don't have double-digit losses. And that is the Spurs with 6 and the Warriors that only have 2. It's kind of surprising that the Spurs have basically kept pace with the Warriors and no one's talking about it. I think that the Spurs are one of the best teams in the league right now, and there's really no one outside the Warriors to compete with them. But I do think that they can compete with the Warriors on a game in, game out, and in a 7-game series. It's going to be interesting to see what happens when the Warriors and Spurs play, as the Warriors haven't really played anyone good, and the Spurs kind of have. I kind of want to see what the game between the Cleveland and the Spurs is, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit here. So I'm going to see what that is, see what the Spurs can do and what the Warriors really are, or if they've just played a bad schedule. But after those teams, there's a slight drop off to 2 teams and another lower tier team, but that's not really near 500, but is kind of close. The 3 and 4 seeds are the bigger name teams who have had a history of being good, and those are the Thunder and the Clippers. The teams that I can see coming out of the conference are the Warriors and Spurs, and possibly the Thunder. The Thunder have both Durant and Westbrook, and if they get going, they should be good. The 2 are the top offensive threats in the league, and I think Westbrook's right up there with Stephen Curry, if he's not better than Curry. And Durant's obviously one of the best shooting small forwards and shooters and everything in the league currently. I don't really see any other team in the West that will even challenge those 3. And to add to that, there are 6 teams that are not in the playoffs, but they're only 3.5 games out. That's really not very good, considering the bottom playoff team is 15 and 20. And on that, there's only 1 team that's really out of the playoffs currently, That's the Lakers, and they're starting to give it a little bit of a resurgence. I think they're 9-20 now. They won the last two night, or no, they've won. They won 2 nights ago behind D'Angelo Russell and his 27 against the Kings, and then they lost last night because Kobe decided not to give up the ball. But I digress. That's usually the things that we see from the East, year in, year out. But this year it's in the West. Speaking of the East, let's talk about them. They only have one team with single-digit losses, and that's the Cavs. I talked about the fact that two teams were under 500 in the West, and that they were in the playoffs. Well, the East has none. In fact, they have a team that's over 500 currently out of the playoffs. And that's usually something we see from the West also. It's definitely a flip script kind of thing early in the year, almost midway through the year actually. But the East also has 3 teams within 2.5 games and 4 within 3.5 of the playoffs last spot. A lot of people will say that this is because the West plays a lot of the East and beats up on them, and vice versa, but it's actually not true. Both conferences have played a majority of their games, at least 75% for all the teams in conference. So the East has played the East, and the West has played the West 75% of the time, at least so far this year. This just means that in the Eastern Conference, anyone can win the game. It doesn't matter really who's playing who. Cleveland could be playing, well, except for the Sixers. Everyone beats the Sixers. I don't know how they have 4 wins. But you could have Cleveland go out and play the number 8 seed Magic, and the Magic could play them really tough, and it'd make it really a close game. And I think in the West, you don't really see that as much. I think, obviously the Warriors are going to beat about anyone in the West, except for maybe the Spurs or the Thunder. But I think that if you have, the Thunder going up against the Clippers, the Thunder are usually going to win that by a pretty healthy margin. And the East, you don't really have that. You just have, this guy, or the Magic were only lost to the Cavs by 4. Wow, they must be really good this year, and they're the 8 seed kind of thing. I mean, in my opinion, I can see up to 5 teams having a chance win the East. Those being Cleveland, Chicago, Miami, kind of Toronto, and kind of Atlanta. Atlanta has to fix a lot of stuff. They're not as deep as they were last year, but they're still a good team. And Toronto, I think, has a lot of good pieces with Kyle Lowry, DeMar DeRozan, a couple other things, but they obviously have some stuff to fix too. I think everyone outside of Cleveland, really, they just tweak a little bit of stuff. They'd have a legitimate shot at winning the East, basically. I think Cleveland's really set with having LeBron and Kyrie and Kevin Love. And then Chicago, they really need to fix their offense, and they'd be right in the thick of things. They're not having really good offense this season. I think they're averaging under 90 points, and defense is always good, but you still need to have some offense to be able to win some games. They're obviously winning because they're number 2 seed, but anyways, then looking at Miami, they have a lot of young pieces. They have Bosch and Wade still in there. They're really good. I think Justice Winslow is really good. Whiteside's really good. Bosch and Wade, like I said, those 4 are probably the best 4 players on their team. They add another piece to make them really good at the shooting guard. Oh, they have DeRozan too, or not DeRozan. Dragic, that's who they have. They have Dragic, and I think that their starting 5, if they have Winslow in there, is really good, but not really top tier yet. I think that they will finish top 5. I think all those teams will finish top 5, maybe a little flip here and there. Toronto in the 3, Atlanta in the 4, Miami in the 5, whatever. Just those are the 5 teams that will finish top 5. At least top 4 of those teams will finish top 4. And I still think that conference that wins the finals is the West, but more depth. The more depth of the teams, I guess, how good the teams are, the quality of opponents and stuff is way higher in the East, just because about anyone can beat anyone, so they're a little bit better games, whereas in the West you're like I said earlier, Warriors are playing, they're winning. Warriors are playing them, they won. Warriors won by 30 kind of thing. So you can't predict those games as easily, and I think that's a little bit better for at least to me. Like I like watching games where anyone can win it, not like, for example, if the Pats, say the Patriots in '07, where we all knew that they were really good 5 games into the season. I didn't really like that because they weren't really going to lose to anyone, kind of thing. So I just, that's just me. That's just my opinion that the West is really weak, and it's because they're just really top heavy with those top 2, 3, if you want to count the Thunder is really good, top 3 teams that kind of beat up on everyone else in their conference. And whereas the East, they're not as good. And that's kind of a byproduct of having the top picks in the draft too. Like obviously it's split kind of down the middle, but more of the top half is like the top 5 of the lottery is generally East teams. Usually Philly at 1 or Cleveland, depending on if they had LeBron or not, or someone like that, or the Knicks. And that's kind of the byproduct. You're getting good young pieces, and then you're kind of rebuilding it and rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding, and then they finally all mesh and figure out they're good, and that's kind of what's happening now. Is that everyone in the East is like, oh, we have really good pieces, let's play them. And I think that's kind of why the East is a little bit better. The West doesn't have any youth. I mean, yeah, they have Durant and Westbrook on the Thunder. Clippers are moderately young. I wouldn't consider DeAndre and Blake really any young anymore. Spurs definitely are. They have Durant, who's like 40. Duncan, who's 40, and a bunch of old pieces. But the Warriors are one of the younger teams too. But I still, in my opinion, the West is going to win the conference or win the NBA Finals. No matter if it's the Warriors or Spurs. But Thunder maybe will lose to the Cleveland. There we go. And I think if the Warriors start getting hurt or start missing shots like they're kind of destined to do, the East will start to take over, but I don't really see that really happening in the near future. I do think it'll happen eventually, where their good luck health-wise catches up to them, or they can't sustain the three-point barrage that they are doing right now. But that's really something for the future, and I think coming out of this year, or at least out of this first couple weeks of the season, we can kind of tell that the East is kind of resurrecting, and they're going to make a little bit more of a challenge to the Warriors or the West. Especially, it's going to be really interesting to see who wins the All-Star game. That's kind of shows you who the stars or how good each conference is, the All-Star game. So I will have a little bit more to talk about here when that rolls around, see who gets selected and all that stuff. So be on the lookout for maybe a little bit follow-up later in the season. So with that, I think I'm going to stop talking about why the West is weak. As I mentioned before, I have a bunch of games of the week, like always. And the first one is the college football playoff. I already previewed it earlier in the podcast. And you can see who I think. And it's between Clemson and Alabama. It's on Monday. So it's going to be an interesting game. I probably will watch it, and I probably have to watch it for my sportscasting class. Thank you, Liberal Arts College. I kind of enjoyed that class. It's really just I love J-term because it's kind of just good fun classes that are for your majors. So I get to take sportscasting this year, and that's why I'm kind of doing this. So moving on to my next one is Cleveland and Dallas. This is NBA, by the way. That's on Tuesday. This is going to be interesting to see because Dallas is having a good year, and Cleveland is having a great year as always because they have LeBron, Kevin Love, Kyrie Irving. And it's going to be an interesting game because Mavericks are kind of old and they kind of have LeBron's number kind of deal. So I'm going to be interested to see what happens there. And then on Wednesday, it's Golden State and Denver. And last time that these two played, Denver took them into overtime. So I'm going to be interested to see if they follow the same path or what's the plan there. If they can take them into overtime again, which would be kind of neat. Especially being a Nuggets fan, I'm gonna be watching that game just a little bit on my phone if I can, and watching the score obviously. So that's gonna be a fun one. And then Cleveland, the Cavs play the Spurs on Thursday, which is gonna be an interesting one for me. For at least I think, because San Antonio's one of the best teams in the league right now, probably the second best behind the Warriors, and Cleveland's always up there really good, and this is always a good matchup, so we're going to see what happens there. And then Miami and Virginia is on Tuesday, and that's the college game. Virginia's coming off a scare from Virginia Tech, and I think that they're a pretty good team. This is going to be a top 15 matchup, hopefully. And Miami's really good this year, and surprisingly good. I mean, they're always good in basketball, but they're top 10 elite talent right there, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens on that game. So I think those are my games of the week for this week, and that's the wrap for this podcast. This has been the Ryno Sports Talk Podcast, number 5. Be on the lookout next week for my blog post, which I don't know what I'm going to do yet. I have to figure that one out. And then another one, another podcast, like always, but this one's going to be a special edition. This will be my 3rd special edition, but this will be a longer form podcast. If you missed my last one, it's about Stuart Scott. I urge you to go watch that. It was one of my favorite ones that I've produced. I really enjoyed that one. So look out for the college football season recap / bowl recap next week, and whatever post I do, I might be doing the bowl recap on my post. So be on the lookout for that. Thanks, and hope you guys have a good, wonderful rest of your week while watching some sports.